Hello, this is Tim64 aka On the Stoop with a quick 10-minute hand example, and today we're going to look at a hand I played just now from a $60 Turbo 6 Max sit and go. And just before we dive into the hand itself, just to set the scene of this particular hand, we have a quick look at the stats on the players. The blue number is the number of hands. So here on this player we have 1.4k hands, the next player we have 2.5k hands, and then this player we have 10k hands. So safe to say all of these players are regs, they're all decent players, and in the long term we're not going to have a big edge on any of these players. You know, it'll be plus or minus 1% ROI either way. So then let's look at the other two players. We have 69 players, 69 hands on the player to our right, 63 to the player, 63 for the player on our right, 69 for the player on our left. Okay, so let's have a quick look at their stats then. We have a VPIP of 88, pre-flop raise of 11, and this player here to our left, VPIP of 18, pre-flop raise of 12. So, safe to say that both of these players are likely to be weaker players. This player here to my right is maybe a little bit loose passive in terms of the gap between the VPIP and the pre-flop raise. But if we look at the player on my right here, I mean, we're talking about almost certainly an incredibly large loser at the games. 88% of hands this guy's playing. So that's really the scene. Setting the scene for this hand, and what it tells us is that really in this game we have to focus all of our attention on this player here, and part of the reason is that clearly he's going to be an incredibly weak player based on his stats, but the key point is that we have position on him. So this player to our left here, yeah, he may be a slightly weaker player, but in the long term we're not going to be able to exploit him as much. We're not going to make as much profit as we would from the same player were he to be on our right. Okay, with all that said, let's jump into the hand itself. So the under the gun player folds, MP folds, and the weak player to our right in the cutoff limps. And as soon as we are dealt this hand on the button and we see that this player is on our right, we should already be planning what to do if he limps, because the chance of him limping, given that he's playing 88% of hands, is incredibly high. So we should already have a plan. And we have two options here. Well, we have three options, of course. We can raise, we can fold, or we can limp behind. I think the first thing to say is that, in my opinion, folding is not really an option. Now, if we basically look at how much money there already is in the pot, there's 50 chips in the pot, and therefore we're getting already 29%, 2.5 to 1 odds on a call. So then what we need to do is have a think about how our hand plays against this range of 88% of hands. Okay, so we're going to use an equity calculator for that purpose. Let's just get rid of that. And first of all, we'll plug in our hand, which is the 8 of spades, 7 of spades, and there's our hand. And then we plug in our opponent's hand, which is, 88%. And we go ahead and evaluate the equities of those hands. And what we see is that we're a slight dog to his hand range, but we have approximately 45% equity. So already we can see that given we expect to have 45% equity against his hand, and we only need 29% equity in a vacuum, not considering any other factors, we already need to call here. Okay, I don't think folding is an option for the reasons I've said, but what about raising? But what about raising? Well, I think there are some very strong reasons for raising, and these are that when we call, although we're going to get better odds on our call very often because the small blind will call behind, and so that will create a bigger pot, and it will also have the added benefit that if we do hit, you know, our straight or our flush, which is really what we're hoping for when we play this kind of hand, speculative hand, there's a better chance of winning a big pot because you know, statistically it's more likely that one of our opponents will have something decent that they can pay us off with. So that's the pros of limping behind with this hand. But the cons are that firstly, this competent regular can pounce on the dead money that we're going to be creating here and make a light re-raise here, a light raise, so that he can isolate the fish and force us to fold, putting in that dead money. And we really don't want that to happen. Even more important, I think, is that we actually don't want to share the value that we see in this player with our opponents, okay? Because if we give them a chance to stack this player, then logically we're missing out on that chance ourselves. So I think that really means everything then leans towards us making a raise. So that's what we do. We go ahead and make an isolation raise of 3 times the value of the limb. I think the sizing of this raise is much less important than the fact of it, okay? Whether it's 50 or 60 or 70 or 80 really doesn't make much difference in my opinion. We're not raising for value because, as we already saw, our hand isn't actually a favorite over the hand that our opponent has. What we're doing is we're raising in order to force these 2 players out unless they have a strong range, okay? And therefore I think these players will fold the vast majority of the hands, and they'll only continue with a strong range, and if they do continue, we'll already know that we're probably quite far behind and we can play accordingly. Okay, so let's see what happens. Small blind folds, the big blind folds, and the limper calls. And of course the limper calls. We're not expecting him to fold, and here's the key point: we don't want him to fold. We don't want to win the 50 chips that are in the pot when we act. We want him to make a bigger mistake post flop. So we go to the flop, and it's a pretty dry flop where really there's nothing that we can represent, but equally we don't expect our opponent to have hit it, although certainly he can have hit it because he's playing 88% of hands. So our opponent checks to us, and we start by betting. I don't think there's any value in checking behind. We have 8 high. We can't get this hand to showdown. But when we bet, we can continue betting on various cards. We can continue betting on a spade because that will bring us a flush draw. We can continue on a 5 because that will give us a gut shot. Similarly, a 6 will give us a gut shot. So there are enough hands that we can continue bluffing with some equity, and similarly, a 7 or an 8 will very often give us the best hand against a player with as wide a range as this player does. So we go ahead and bet, and our opponent calls. And we go to the turn, and the turn is a very interesting card. It's a card which really hits our perceived raising range, and so we're somewhat surprised when our opponent leads into us for approximately half pot. And this is where we use the reads that we've got from this player, which I'll just go into in a moment. But even in a vacuum, having no previous information about this player, I think this is a great spot to make a bluff raise, because this card really hits our range and not our opponent's range. And if he did have a king, certainly if it was a strong king, I think he'd very often go for a check raise here, or if he was wanting to induce us versus our bluff range, I think he'd just check here. So when he leads, it really looks like either air or some sort of weak pocket pair like pocket sixes, which is sort of turning itself into a bluff, or possibly some sort of gut shot or flush draw on the flop, which doesn't want to check call a bigger bet on the turn. But then we check the notes that we've made on this player from the 63 hands that we have in the past, and we see that I've made a note saying op better. Now that's short for opposite better, and an opposite better is a player who bets when he has nothing and checks when he has a strong hand. And it's a very typical betting pattern for a weak player to have. That is, he likes to trap when he has a very strong hand and get his opponent to do the betting for him, and when he has nothing, he tries to push his opponent off their hand by making bets. So yeah, we have opposite better, we have a note that says he keeps betting, we have a note that says he limps and then stabs, and just a general wrap up at the end saying that he's a horrid player. So I think that's enough information given the board texture that we go ahead and make a bluff raise here. And again, I think the sizing is not too important. We could even go ahead and make it slightly smaller, and I think if we knew that a smaller raise here would induce our opponent to make a further raise that would be even more incentive for doing that. But obviously with 8 high we're quite happy to take the pot down here. And I'm expecting this to get a lot of folds, but here our opponent does something pretty strange, and that's that he clicks it back here. And I think against 90% of opponents, you'd just say, okay, this is the time to just give up on the hand. Obviously our opponent has a king, or he has, you know, a 4, which is really what he's repping here, and just, you know, just give up on the hand. But if we think about the fact that our opponent has 88% of hands, and then we think about the very specific note that we have on him, which is that he's an opposite better, it really doesn't add up that he would play a 4 like this, okay? I think we'd see him check calling a 4 right down to the river, and then perhaps donk shoving. So the hand that he's representing doesn't really make sense, and I just don't think anyone would play a king here this way, because they'd have to be a little bit worried that we have a stronger king. We can exclude, you know, king queen and ace king from his range anyway, because he does raise some hands. So really he's representing such a narrow range that I think a shove here should be profitable. The pot is already 1,235, so investing our remaining 995 chips means that he has to fold well under 50% of the time, and I would hazard a guess that he would fold at least 80% of the time here. So the fact that we have basically no equity against the hand that calls us is pretty much neither here nor there. So we do go ahead and shove as a pure bluff, and we get the fold. And I mean, this is something that I'll do probably about once a week. It's that rare for me to make a pure bluff shove, and it's completely read based and based on the texture of the board. But the key point of this hand is to show that when you have the right notes on a player, you can use those notes to choose the absolute optimal line, and your hand itself becomes much less important than your reads on your opponent. Okay, hopefully that was of use to you guys, and there'll be more here, so keep checking back from time to time. Thanks very much indeed. This is Tim64, aka On the Stoop.